beautiful thing to have the gospel recessional after the reading. The bad part about it is I don't have it in front of me when I'm preaching, so fortunately we've got another one here. Oh goodness, we've got to advance this up. There's a popular song from, I don't know, 20 years ago, so it was popular in kind of the new folk country movement, but band went on to become very big, and then, the writer of the song, who was the lead singer of the band, he's got his own show now and his own things, very famous. And he was, and his family were raised in a Protestant upbringing, very strict evangelical kind of fundamentalist. He talks about this, and he talks about how he had to break away from that in order to embrace the wide world, and he wanted to get into the music business and be famous, and this just didn't seem compatible. The things he wanted to do with his life weren't at all compatible with his fundamentalist upbringing, very strict moral code and sense of operating, I suppose, by lists of do's and don'ts. At least that's the way he presents it. And he writes a song earlier in his career, and he calls the song Doubting Thomas. And he says, that's me, I'm a doubting Thomas, he says. But he kind of says it, if you can imagine, with a little bit of a wink and a smile. He's not condemning himself for doubting. Rather, what he's really saying is, I'm escaping from the prison of this little sect or cult, or from the authority that came with all that. And I'm embracing the big wide world of experience and science and whatever else may be there. But mostly what I'm doing is I'm embracing my personal freedom, which I found to be crushed by living under this very strict code, which always demanded above all that you have faith, And faith for him was a burden that crushed his freedom. And so how happy he was to get rid of it. And he wrote this kind of impious little song as a way of signaling, I suppose, to all of his old friends, to his parents, I'm out of the faith thing. Now, so I don't want to get too much into trying to criticize what I imagine might be the sort of upbringing that the young man had, that really had problems in its conception of Christianity and its conception of faith, such that some of his rebellion might have been legitimate. That would be a different conversation. But what I want to talk about is the idea of faith in general. That faith in general is about a personal object, not any sort of authority figure merely in this world, but about God himself, who's entered into this world, who's taken on our nature, and who has shown himself worthy of our faith. Yes, there's a risk involved. You see the risk played out here in the drama of Thomas the Apostle. You might imagine that he says, hey, look, God gave me eyes to see with. God gave me 5 senses. He gave me a reasoning mind. Now you're asking me to believe that something which I've always known to be impossible, people come back from the dead, happened. Now, okay, yeah, there was Lazarus. Maybe he was there, maybe he wasn't. but he knows Lazarus is dead. Is our master really back? Is it him? If it were to be him, he'd have to have the same body. I'd have to be able to recognize him. I'd have to be able to look him in the eye, to hear his voice, and see his wounds. That's the price of my belief. And one might say, well, goodness, there's no faith involved at all if you have to see something. And I don't know that this is particularly true. After all, if I'm presented with the sight of something, which I otherwise am convinced is impossible, I'll try to come up with every possible explanation I can to explain away what this otherwise impossibility. We do this all the time. This is the basis of science. We say we have a knowledge of how nature works. We know certain things can and can't happen. And if something occurs which is unprecedented, which is outside of the course of nature, we don't rush to credulity, but rather we say, let's come up with a natural explanation. And I recommend that we continue with this path. It's only the case that at the end of all of our natural explanations, something remains to be explained. Something remains to be explained. The nature of the human condition, of our striving and secretly sometimes desire to move beyond merely this world of matter, and definitely to move beyond death. No matter how much someone may tell us death is just a part of life, it's a part of the cycle of nature, and you have to just accept it. It's a psychological disease to be afraid of death. When it comes, peacefully walk into the night. Human beings habitually refuse to obey that instruction. And so we see that there is a limit beyond which natural explanations aren't simply enough. And yet if an explanation comes to me, I have somehow to use the equipment that's been given, not only my five senses, but also my reason. If there were a God, and if he were a person or personal, like the Christian faith says he is, we might expect that the way in which he wants to interact with us is a personal form of interaction. So that belief in him is not something merely abstract, but rather it's a personal encounter. Like something analogous to when we have friends and we meet the friend and we say, look, there are all sorts of things I might learn about you from reading a biography, but I would rather get to know you, to speak with you, to be with you. I would rather get to know you also in the company of your friends. And this is the way that Thomas and the disciples understand how Jesus has mediated God to them. And so when Thomas hears this news, this testimony, that their master has arisen, I would like to argue rather strenuously that he says, I want to see him and speak with him and be with him. I want to receive the same personal testimony from him about his resurrection as I received from him when before his death, when we walked with him and heard him speaking about God. Now it seems like everything here is on the cusp of being explained. But here I am, still a man with my 5 senses that God gave me, with the reason that God gave me, and with the heart that has been awakened by this personal contact with the Lord, the Master, the Kyrios, the Rabbi, our teacher. That's happened in the company of our friends, of his friends. They've come to me and they've made this witness. We've seen the Lord. And I have to be one with them. I have to be in their company. And so he says, I need to see him. And I also need to see him with the evidence that it's the same one I knew and knew to have been crucified. I want to see the wounds. And this is a remarkable request that we might not have expected him to ask. But it shows some insight into how Thomas has already started to understand something about who Jesus is. That if he is to have come back to life, the signs of his suffering should remain with him. Should remain with him. Because it's that suffering that represents his real mission. And his conquering of that suffering isn't merely just his appearance again, strong and rejuvenated. It also has to be a reminder of what he went through. These intuitions are here in Thomas when he asks this question. And the Lord grants him his request. Yes, Thomas, this is good what you've asked. I'm going to give it to you. You've asked to see me and to speak with me and hear my voice and to see my wounds. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to ask you to use this other sense of yours, the sense of touch, to reach into the side that was pierced. Now, the scripture doesn't actually say, and then Thomas put his hand into the side and touched the wounds on his hands. So on one hand, we might say that we're free to hold it either way. In other words, we're free to think that Thomas said, I have enough evidence now I believe. But we're also free to assume that he did as Jesus invited him. And over the course of the years, I've come to be convinced that it's this second option. Jesus invites him. Not as a scolding, but as an answer to the desire of his heart to have a meeting with the resurrected but still wounded heart of Christ. As a matter of fact, there's one very important theologian of fairly recent times who said that we should think about Thomas reaching out and placing his hand on the wound of Christ, and as it were, reaching in and grabbing a hold of the beating heart of Christ, so that that life pulses through him, animates him, changes him forever. Changes Thomas's heart into the heart of Christ, as all the disciples had to be changed so that they could represent that wounded and healing heart to the world. I like this image very much. And therefore, we kind of come around full circle now, and I'd like to say to this fellow that we talked about who wrote the song Doubting Thomas, as if he were sitting here. I guess maybe if I had a chance to mention his name, it might be more likely that it would get out on the internet and he would find out someone talked about him, but I won't do that. But if you were standing here, I would say, consider again, on the one hand, that being in a position of doubt about something almost too marvelous to believe in is not only a natural situation, it's also the situation of our fallenness, that our hope is dim, that we need the object of our hope, as it were, to come and meet us and to resurrect in us the hope and the faith that we require to look beyond our situation, to look beyond our death. And then second of all, is to realize that this, if you will, unbelievingness had an object. It was aimed at a thing. And when it saw the thing itself come towards him, it asked something of it, of him. Show yourself to me, so that I can believe. And then Thomas earns, if you will, a better nickname merely than doubting. He may very well have been, in this gospel, he's the first recorded to have confessed not only that Jesus is Lord, their teacher, their rabbi, but also to confess his divinity. It's in this moment that the church says we confess Christ as Lord and God when we have seen his resurrected body. And then Jesus says, you've seen me, and therefore you believe. But there will be others who won't have had this same kind of physical five-sense interaction with me. And yet they will believe in me too. And they will be even more blessed. That's us. So when we see this icon right down here to my left, the icon of the divine mercy, the rays are coming out of the heart, the wounded and pierced heart of Christ. These are the rays of light, the rays that put us into a position in which we can see, as it were, the object of our hope before us. It means the possibility of faith in more than what this world can offer. The possibility of faith in a life, in a reality beyond death. Not just the physical death that we know waits for us, but the thing that physical death represents. The great sin that alienates us from God and from one another. And so with Thomas and in the company of all of the disciples and all of the church throughout the ages of time, we stand with them and we say, my Lord and my God,